Hi, everybody. It's an honor to be here today. I was looking through the program earlier this morning, and I was seeing talks about STEM education, careers in AI, CS, the future of work, and here I am now giving a talk about the science of consciousness. This might seem like it's a huge divergence from the rest of the program, but I actually want to convince you today that the science of consciousness not only has huge implications for the future of work, but is also the most urgent moral imperative of our time, because it is, I think, the surest path to the ultimate elimination of mental suffering. But before I try to convince you of these grandiose claims, let me first tell you a story. So growing up in a 3-generation household, I cherished a deep and unbreakable bond with my grandfather. When I was 4 years old, he was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, and my family decided to look after him at home, so I witnessed firsthand the struggles of caring for an Alzheimer's patient. My parents are both civil engineering professors, and I spent a lot of time growing up hanging out at their lab and tinkering with their gadgets and sensors. So I was inspired to create technological solutions to improve the quality of my grandfather's care. At age 6, my family and I took a trip to Egypt, and I noticed that my grandfather was starting to forget to take his medicine. So when we went back home, I went to the local drugstore, got a medicine box with a different compartment for each day of the week, and I put an LED light and a buzzer inside each compartment so that the medicine box would alert my grandfather to take the right medicine at the right time. I called this the smart medicine box. Around the same time, my grandfather was starting to wander out of bed at night. I distinctly remember one August morning when my entire family was awoken by a sharp knock on the door. We were all shocked to see my grandfather, still in his pajamas, standing next to a policeman who told us that my grandfather had been wandering on a nearby highway. Had the police officer not very luckily spotted him, a very serious accident definitely could have happened. So over the years, my grandfather's wandering became more frequent as his condition progressed, and my family and I had to start taking turns looking after him. Around the time that I was 14, my grandfather was starting to wander out of bed at least once per night. Furthermore, his vision deteriorated significantly as a result of his Alzheimer's, and so he often fell down and suffered injuries when he wandered. My mother and I, around this time, moved to New York City, so my aunt became my grandfather's only caregiver. She had to stay awake all night to keep an eye on him, but it was hard to catch him leaving the bed. I became very concerned about her well-being as well as my grandfather's safety, so I decided to take matters into my own hands and try to create a solution. But how? One night, I was back home in California during Thanksgiving break of my freshman year of high school, and I was on night watch looking after Grandpa. I spotted him stepping out of bed, and the moment that his foot landed on the floor, I thought of a solution. I thought, why don't I put a pressure sensor on my grandfather's foot that would detect an increase in pressure when my grandpa got out of bed, and that would send an alert to my aunt's smartphone, waking her up. That way, she wouldn't have to stay awake all night, keeping an eye on him. Now, this seemingly simple idea proved extremely difficult to execute. There were 3 main challenges. The first was I had to create a pressure sensor that was thin and soft and comfortable enough for my grandpa to wear on his foot. I also had to design a wireless circuit that would transmit signals from the sensor to my aunt's smartphone. And finally, I had to code a smartphone app that would reliably trigger instant alerts. I tapped into every possible resource, joining online tech forums, reaching out to experts, studying literature, but weeks of intense research often resulted in little progress and much frustration. There was a point where I almost gave up, but the deep pain that I felt about my inability to reverse my grandfather's condition became my renewed impetus to push through and complete a prototype. So here on the right, you can see the smartphone app, and on the left, you can see the sensor that would be taped onto my grandfather's heel. I'll never forget the moment when my device first caught my grandfather's wandering. I was struck, deeply, deeply struck, by the power of technology to change lives for the better. During a one-year test, the device never failed to catch my grandfather's wandering, and as a result, we all slept much better, and he suffered no further injuries. Around this time, I also started to receive some unexpected recognition for SafeWander, which was what I named my device. I won the Scientific American Science in Action Award at the 2014 Google Science Fair, and NBC Nightly News also reported about my story. I realized after this that my family's burdens were just a snapshot of a much larger societal challenge, especially because I started to receive many heartwarming letters from caregivers around the world who are very eager to use my sensor. There are over 50 million dementia patients worldwide, and it's estimated that about 60% of them wander. In addition, 1 in 3 seniors is at risk of falling. I realized that there were many families around the world who might benefit from SafeWander. So I tested my device at local care facilities, and I integrated their feedback to create a more versatile, user-friendly, and reliable sensor. Here on the right, you can see the newest version of the sensor, which is a button that gets attached onto patients' pajamas. Rather than detecting changes in pressure, this one detects changes in body angle so that caregivers receive alerts on their smartphones when their patients are rising up out of the bed. On the left, you can see a signal amplifier that's plugged into an outlet next to the patient's bed that relays the Bluetooth signal from the sensor to the nearby Wi-Fi so that caregivers can receive alerts no matter where they are. After 2 years of hard work spent prototyping and also learning the complex world of entrepreneurship, we successfully launched SafeWander online, and now there are over 1,000 families around the world who are using the sensor. And here you can also see the sensor in action. Now, despite bringing this product to market and giving peace of mind to thousands of people, there was one device that I could not invent. In particular, I couldn't find a way to preserve my grandfather's fading consciousness. I remember quizzing my grandpa with a number of questions in order to jog his memory. Grandpa, what did you eat for lunch today? Where are we right now? What's my name? And I was troubled by his growing inability to remember these simple facts. Yet, it was his vacant expression when I asked him the most basic of all questions, Grandpa, are you there, that I found most devastating. Had Grandpa lost his sense of self, his personal identity? Was he still the same person who I loved so dearly? And if not, then who was he? I was heartbroken that the man who had once cradled me in his tender arms now seemed like he was a million miles away. After my grandfather passed away from Alzheimer's, I've spent my years in college consumed with this inquiry into his lost consciousness. I was fortunate to become a research intern at the Genetics and Aging Research Unit in Harvard Medical School, where I investigated the hypothesis that amyloid beta, long thought to be the cause of Alzheimer's, might actually serve an intrinsically protective role in the brain, because it fights against infections by bacteria and other pathogens. As I wrote about in a Scientific American op-ed column early this year, this research could yield treatments that actually target the underlying root of the disease. But I still struggle to understand how bacteria could have possibly affected my grandfather's self-awareness. In particular, what was the correspondence between an infected neuron and a loss of consciousness? Is consciousness reducible to just the activity of neurons in the brain? If so, how is an individual neuron conscious? And if not, then how does the brain give rise to consciousness? As I started reading about consciousness from a variety of different perspectives, I was astonished to find many philosophers who claim that consciousness is actually more fundamental than the brain. In his book, The Conscious Mind, the philosopher David Chalmers discusses the so-called hard problem of consciousness, which asks how the physical activity in the brain gives rise to our rich, vivid inner subjective experience. Now, the reason why it might seem like consciousness is more fundamental than the brain is that there seems to be this huge gap between the physical events in the brain and our felt subjective experience. For example, it seems like the felt experience of pain is categorically different from the stimulation of some fibers in my nervous system. Now, over the years, philosophers in both the East and the West have proposed many different solutions to the hard problem of consciousness, even though it wasn't known as such back then. In the Yogacara school of Buddhism, for example, it's believed that everything is consciousness. And in the West, the philosopher René Descartes, who was arguably the first person to think seriously about consciousness, believed that the mind, i.e. consciousness, and matter are two fundamentally separate things. But all of this is philosophy, and centuries-old debates about the metaphysics of mind and matter are unlikely to make any progress anytime soon. So I began to wonder whether consciousness can be studied scientifically. And I think the answer is yes. This summer, I had the unique privilege of interning at the Qualia Research Institute, which is a consciousness research nonprofit based out in San Francisco. The Qualia Research Institute is very small right now. It's only 6 people, including me. And QRI's approach rests on 2 fundamental philosophical assumptions. The first is that there is a precise mathematical structure that corresponds to your subjective experience. And the second is that there is a way to objectively measure how good or bad a subjective experience feels. These 2 assumptions are the foundation for QRI's symmetry theory of valence, which says that if there is this mathematical object that corresponds to your subjective experience, then the symmetry of that object is what encodes how good or bad that experience feels. Now, what exactly do I mean by symmetry, especially as I'm starting to see some furrowed eyebrows out here in the audience? So, there are the symmetries that we're all familiar with in everyday life, like the symmetry of a square or the symmetry of the human body. And in physics, symmetry actually has an even broader definition. It's defined as any kind of an invariance under transformation. That means the aspects of a system that don't change when a transformation is applied to that system. Again, this all might sound very abstract. The symmetry that's relevant in particular for the study of consciousness and QRI's research is actually the symmetry of music. So here I've plotted out the frequency over time of a harmonious musical chord. You can see that the curve repeats itself every t seconds, which means that if we were to shift the curve by that amount t, then nothing would change. The curve would remain invariant. Now, why does any of this matter, you might ask? The key idea behind QRI's research is that the brain is like a musical instrument. It resonates at certain natural frequencies that are harmonious. And those harmonious frequencies are associated with more pleasant subjective experiences. So, how exactly do we measure harmony in the brain? Well, recently, this neuroscientist at Oxford named Selin Adesoy created this paradigm called connectome-specific harmonic waves. These are waves that cycle through the brain at its natural harmonious frequencies. So, based on the connectome-specific harmonic waves, we can calculate the consonance, that is the harmony, between 2 pairs of brain harmonics, and we can also calculate the dissonance, or the lack of harmony, between brain harmonics. So here in these 2 diagrams, the thickness of the blue arrows corresponds to the amount of consonance or harmony in between brain harmonics, and the thickness of the red arrows corresponds to the amount of dissonance. Now, the one on the left, because it has more consonance, is associated with a more pleasant subjective experience, and the diagram on the right is associated with a more negative subjective experience because there's a greater amount of dissonance. Much in the same way that we can map out all the colors based on just 3 values, R, G, and B, which correspond to red, green, and blue, we can also map out all the different ways that a subjective experience can feel positive or negative based on just 3 values: the consonance, the dissonance, and the noise. So firstly, I just want to say that the symmetry theory of valence currently doesn't have that much evidence to support it. We're still right now in the process of gathering the very first bits and pieces of evidence to substantiate the theory. But if it turns out to be true, it's going to have groundbreaking implications for society. Now, why is this the case? What we're essentially showing here is that the natural equilibrium for the brain is harmony. When we're more productive or when we're motivated, that's essentially the brain's chase after this symmetry or harmony. Now, you might ask, how can we apply this to find ways for us to become more motivated and more productive? One potential avenue is meditation. So keep in mind again here that the key metaphor is that the brain is like a tuning fork that resonates at certain natural frequencies. Unfortunately, for most of us, our tuning forks are cluttered with schmutz. We're distracted a lot of the time. We're anxious, we're stressed, we're tired. And all of that is preventing the brain from resonating at those natural frequencies. When we clear up that schmutz through meditation, we're able to find ways for the brain to achieve that natural equilibrium of harmony. But I want to think even broader, actually, here than the future of work. Because once we figure out the mathematical structure that corresponds to positive and negative experiences, we'll be able to radically improve the quality of subjective experience for all people. Let me say that again because it's a point that's worth emphasizing. Once we figure out the mathematical structure underlying positive and negative experiences, we can radically improve the quality of subjective experience for all people. The reason why is because once we figure out the math, we can determine what's known as the state space of consciousness. You can think of this as the map in which every point corresponds to a different variety of subjective experience. Now, with this map, we can determine what I call the paradise states of consciousness. These are states of consciousness with intense joy and compassion and 0 mental suffering. And furthermore, we'll be able to design interventions that reliably and sustainably induce these paradise states of consciousness. These will likely be far more effective for treating depression and anxiety than existing antidepressants, and I think they can also radically improve baseline mental health for all people. So the reason why I say that studying the science of consciousness is the most urgent moral imperative of our time is that society is still trapped in deep cycles of mental suffering in spite of all the significant material progress that we've made in recent decades. In spite of the fact that quality of life has improved substantially in the last century, many of us are still suffering very, very deeply. Rather than seeking ways to advance the material conditions of society, it seems like the best path forward is to alter your subjective experience from the inside out. And I think that's why the science of consciousness is the surest path to ending mental suffering in the long run and why we can ultimately engineer paradise. Thank you very much.